Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In today's episode of Alte Geschichte im Dialog, I'm talking to Professor Christian Meyer from the University of Bergen. Professor Meyer is the leading expert of the Palmyrene, an area in southwest Syria, which is the border territory of the Roman Empire for some time, and of course the territory for the city of Palmyra, in which we are very interested in this term. He is also a very skilled examiner for aerial photographs, so I'm especially pleased to have him here with us today. Christian, let's talk at first about what is the Palmyrene? What do we find there in that very specific area of the world?
First, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be able to share my fascination and my knowledge of the landscape around Palmyra. As in every part of the world, it's very important to understand the geographical and climatic condition that makes history. And I will start giving you some facts about the conditions of central Syria. So I will share from here we have a satellite photo of Syria with Jordan down here, Iraq here. And Palmyrena is normally to the area around Tadmur. That's the normal name of Palmyra, or Palmyra as it was called in the Roman antiquity. And it is indeed a huge area. There's about 200 kilometers from Damascus to Palmyra. That's a week's travel. And again, 1 week's travel if you go from Palmyra up to Deir ez-Zor. Palmyra is often labeled the queen of the desert. Of course, that's good for tourists. But in fact, the area around Palmyra is not a desert. And now I'm going to show some pictures from the area. The area around Palmyra is a huge dry steppe. It might look very dry here, but as you can see in the middle of the photo, you can see herds of sheep using the vegetation. And it's the characteristic thing is that it rains every year, and that means that there's vegetation during the winter. This is a very flat landscape, but if you go to the northern territory, north of Palmyra, you can see mountains as we have here. It's just north of Palmyra. And those mountains were in antiquity covered with trees, as we can see here. They have in modern time simply cut down in the hunt for charcoal. And here you see that it rains every year in this area. And that's different from, as an example, the desert in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula or parts of Sahara. And the Bedouins, they call this not a desert, but a dry steppe, and the word for that is Bacha. If they talk about a desert, they called it Sahara, and that's the name we also use for Sahara. And you can see there's quite a lot of rain during the winter, and it can also be very cold during the winter. There can be, in fact, be snow in Palmyra. And then you can see how the temperature rises during the summer month and then fall again in the autumn. And I will show you a good picture of the dry steppe in the wet season. As you have a look here, it's probably not what you expected of the Syrian desert. But this is, in fact, how it looks in the dry season. You will see a lot of vegetations, and the sheep and goat, they will like it, I can assure you that. Another thing that is about the wildlife in this region of Syria. And of course, we don't know what it was like in antiquity, but in antiquity, there were some Bedouins who made a lot of graffiti, also picture graffiti, and you can see here. And here you can see lions, gazelles, hyenas, ostriches up here, who has roamed this territory. So I think that's, in fact, the best proof that what we are dealing with here is not a desert, and it's very important to keep that in mind, but it is a dry steppe. Yes?
Thank you. Thank you very much. That leads me directly to my next question. You've shown us, or now we are still on the screen, the graffitis of Bedouins. What are the other sources which inform us about the Palmyrene? So how do we know about it in antiquity?
In fact, we have very few sources from the Palmyrene itself. We have the graffiti that we see here, made by the Bedouins in the Roman period and probably also in the early Islamic period. And they were literate. They wrote names, they wrote what they were doing, they wrote about their family, they wrote about wars and other things. And that's a very good source. And then, of course, we have Palmyra itself in the Roman period up to about the Umayyad period in the 7th century. There we have the archaeological sources. We have the inscriptions, especially from the Roman period, who tells us about the life in Palmyra and also the relationship between Palmyra and the surrounding territory. Otherwise, it is sources from outside Palmyrene. As an example, in the Bronze Age, we have archives from Ebla in western Syria. We have from Mari in the eastern part of Syria. And there were Bronze Age cities, and they were dealing with the population in the Palmyrene. Very often warfare, and then we have them in the sources. And that also deals with when we have the Assyrian Empire, both in the late Bronze Age and in the early Iron Age, that is after 1000 before Christ. They also tell us about the relationship between the cities in the border zone between the Palmyrene dry steppe and the more populated part of Syria, the relationship between the cities there and the populations on the dry steppe. Otherwise, we have this famous man, Antoine Poix-de-Bois, and also his fellow Moutet, who got a very good idea. They took an aeroplane from the First World War, and then they flew over Syria, parts of Jordan and Iraq, and took a huge amount of photographs. And they registered Roman, primarily what they thought were Roman military installations and forts. Many of them was in fact from the Umayyad period. But there we really get a much broader view of the Palmyrene in the Roman and also late antiquity, with primary military installations and roads. And then there has also been surveys north of Palmyra. Here we see the mountains north of Palmyra. Here we have Palmyra down here. And there were French surveys in 1930s. And we followed up from 2008 and up to 2011 with surveys. And here you can see the result of our surveys. What we see here is villages and estates north of Palmyra. So that is our, let's say, sources for understanding of Palmyra. It goes both economically, as you can see here, but also politically when the population of the Palmyrean area interacted with the cities along Euphrates or in the western part of Syria.
Okay, so you mentioned these huge amounts of estates one can still trace via the surveys and the aerial footage. And you already mentioned the Bedouins, which brings me to the question, who lived in the Palmyrene? Like, it was a dry steppe, but were there only Bedouins? Or what did, who else was there? Or can we even understand whether there was a difference between Bedouins and other people?
Well, in fact, in most of the history of this Batia, the Palmyrene, it was inhabited by nomads or semi-nomads. And they were moving from summer to winter pastures with their herds. In the Bronze Age, it was sheep, primarily sheep. Later on, they go out in the Iron Age, they got the camels. And some of them were semi-nomads, that is, the part of the family or part of the tribe were living along, as an example, Euphrates. And there they could have houses, gardens, and other things. And other parts of the tribe were moving on the dry steppe. So we must understand that is the normal condition for life all through history, from the Bronze Age up to the First World War. Or as an example, in the Ottoman Empire, it was a very low degree of sedentations, or cities, and other things. There was one exception, Palmyra, which came in the Roman period. But we must understand that this is the normal way of life in the Palmyra area. Here we see a sheikh around the First World War, visited by Gertrude Bell, a famous British explorer. And he was in fact having a house near Euphrates, but the most of the year he spent out in the so-called desert, or the Badger, with his tribe and the animals there. But of course there was, we can just show you one more map. Here we have winter pastures, and then we got the hot summer, and then people move to the periphery, up to the north of Palmyra. Here we have Palmyra here, close to the Euphrates, because there are not much fodder in the center here in the summer period. So they're moving up and down, up and down. One exception is, of course, Palmyra, this wonderful city that we see here. And it was really a metropolis. It was a big city. We don't know how many people were living there. But if it was 20 or 20,000 people, it was a huge amount of people in central Syria, which we have never seen before. And there can be no doubt that this was related to opening up the caravan route from Palmyra across the Batia, the dry steppe here, to Euphrates, and then the goods were moved down to the Indian Ocean. But then you may ask, did they have any agriculture then, such a big city?
Yes, of course. I wanted to ask that because I think we always think of this dry steppe as an area which doesn't lend itself to agriculture, to the growing of grain or olives or stuff like that. But I think your surveys found something different.
Oh, yes. Agriculture is quite normal on the dry steppe. In fact, the Bedouins are doing it themselves. Here we have a beautiful graffiti. Here you have the name of the man doing it. And here you can see a pair of oxen and plow in the middle. You see, the Bedouins, they need also to have cereals to live. If they slaughter the animals, they can't live by that. They need to be all the time in symbiosis with the cities and villages around them. And they need cereals. And to understand that, we need to know a little bit more about the dry steppe again. Where do they make their fields? In the wadis, as you can see here. This is a satellite photo, which is another good source for this area. And you can see all the green here. This is a wadi. A wadi is where the floods are coming here in the valley, and they are normally dry most of the year, but there's a lot of water coming here. And they made a lot of walls to retain the water and the moist soil behind the walls. That's how it looks today. Can you see all the, and that is in fact ancient fields that we have here, and that the Bedouins, they were they had agriculture. And then you can ask me, but how is that possible?
Yes.
You have to look at the soil. I will take the next picture here. This is the surface of the Bacha. You can see all the green grass up here, and of course that's something for the sheep and goat and camels. But this is a very hard surface, and it's kept together by all the roots. It might be yellow with no vegetation during the summer, but still the roots are just below the surface. When it rains here, the water will not go through this upper crust. It will flow on the top as a runoff. And that's how it looks. Just after a small shower, you can see the shower here in the background, and after 10 minutes, the water is coming there. And that is the key. Nature concentrates the water in the wadis, and if you can use the water in the wadis, you can have very good agriculture there. And the yields are in fact much higher than yields in the Mediterranean area. Normally it's 5-1. Here you may get 10-1. That's very much, that very high yields. And if you have a look at Palmyra here we have Palmyra. And you can see all the wadis here. When it's raining up here, all the water in this area here will be let down to this area here, a depression, and there you can also see all the fields. And we know they used it in antiquity, because in the middle of fields, we have this beautiful altars here for Bel-Shamin, the god of fertility and rain. So there were, of course, there were limitations to how big areas they could cultivate. But in the areas they cultivated with this runoff water, there was enough water, and they were indeed very fertile. And you can see in the background, you can see the sheep there. They're coming after the harvest and leaving their dung to fertilize the fields too. So it would probably not been no problem to feed the population of Palmyra.
This story of the wadis and the run of water just reminds me of the, at least I was told when I was as a kid in dry areas, to never camp in a wadi, because a few dozen or 100 kilometers away it might rain, and so you might just drown in the night in your tent, because, well, suddenly the dry wadi becomes a stream.
And I have a small video which can illustrate this. This is from 2019, January.
You might think it's a stream.
That's really, and those streams here can destroy bridges and roads. And if you're caught in the middle of this, as you say, you might drown. Some of my good friends were close to being, to lose their lives during this. And what we can see here, how did the ancients deal with that? Could you imagine when you have your beautiful fields and then it was rain and then you got all the water washing away the fields and the soil? They have to do something about it, and they did it. They built dams. And normally we connect dams like this with, let's say, to preserve the water for the hot season. No, it's not.
Entirely
it is
opposite.
to regulate the water in the wet seasons. So you have, oh, sorry. I think I can go back, yes. So you have simply the water behind here, and then you regulate it to the fields downstream here.
Okay, so hydroengineering in a dry zone. Fascinating.
Yes, we know also that from Yemen and other places, they were really experts. But then, of course, you might ask me, why did Palmyra then disappear?
Of course.
Because it did that in late antiquity. Why haven't we got cities in central Syria up through history using this winter rain coming here? Well, there's a slight problem. I can illustrate that. We always talk about climate changes as a threat, etc. The point is that climate changes is not a threat to the agriculture, because even if it doesn't rain much, it will still concentrate the water in the fields. But there's another threat. Here we have the normal rain pattern in central Syria. And this is the 200 millimeter limit. And that is normal, let's say, for growing barley. But the problem is that's not every year. There might be years where it looks like this. So that the 200 millimeter is in fact close to Aleppo. And then we have really got a problem in central Syria. Not so much with agriculture, but if you look at the landscape, this is from just north of Palmyra in the spring. And let's have a look. This is from 2019, exactly in the same month in the spring.
Huge difference.
It's a huge difference. And the real problem is there might be years or even spell of years with very low precipitation, which is no threat to agriculture, but it's a threat to the Bedouins. And we know that those spells might be, in fact, up to 50 years. We have dendrochronology in those bushes here. And we can see that might be 50 years with lower precipitation and then 50 years with higher precipitation. And now we are getting close to what is the problem in this area. Let's have a look here. Could you imagine you have beautiful agriculture around Palmyra as an example, and even up here where we also have signs of agriculture in the Roman period. Then we have a very bad winter here. were less rain. So they had to leave the area before the harvest up here. And then you got the conflict between what we can call the desert and the sound.
Oh, okay. So basically the Bedouins then needed the crops to feed their animals because they depended on the animals.
Exactly. And then you got the conflicts, and that calls for what we call conflict solution in some way or another. We know in the Ottoman period, it was a huge problem. And the Bedouins were, in fact, controlling the area close to Aleppo. And the governor in Aleppo, he hasn't got much control of those Bedouins on the dry steppe. So this connection between the desert and the sound is in many ways the key to understand the role of Palmyra and also the importance of the Palmyran territory.
So it was basically that Palmyra had the methods to integrate or not to integrate, but to mediate between the needs of the agriculture in the Palmyrene and the needs of the Bedouins, which moved in and out of the Palmyrene depending on season.
That's exactly the case. Because the Palmyrans themselves were descended from the dry steppe. And it's very normal that nomads change from the, let's say, a nomadic way of living in cities. We can all see that in the Arab period. It's no problem. They can change just like this. But they also mean that they retained the social, perhaps also family connections to the population on the dry steppe. And perhaps many of all those villages I showed you on the map of northern Palmyra, they had been inhabited by semi-nomads. Some of the families or some of the tribes were living up there. The rest moved from winter to summer pastures. Of course, it doesn't remove the trouble, but it's much easier to find a solution to it because you speak the same language. You belong to the same social group. And the border zone between Palmyra and up to Aleppo is very deep. You have a large territory to absorb conflicts. And that's different from other periods. So one say that Palmyra is essential to understand the importance of the Palmyrene between East and West. Not between the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire, but between, let's say, the agricultural zone here and the nomadic zone here. And as we know, in the Arab period, with the coming of Islam, that is very important for the stability of the societies in the Middle East. And there, Palmyra was very important. If they were brokers, we may say that, between the desert and the sound.
And then, of course, they also used the talents of their nomadic cousins, so to speak, to participate in the long-distance trade via the Euphrates.
That's exactly, and of course the nomads benefited for that also. They shared the surplus. The Bedouins gave the animals, the guides, and security. That was not. They have to pay for it. But then you may ask, what happened when Zenobia disappeared? We all know after Zenobia, the Romans took over Palmyra. And all the social connections between Palmyra and the Batia must have disappeared.
Did they just go back to their tents?
No, they have to do something about this. And we have a very famous military road called Strata di Cruciana. And very often it has been seen as defense against the Persians in the east. But I think that at least the stretch from Damascus up to Palmyra here must be seen in another light. Those forts and stations that we see here is very strange because they are not lying on the normal road from Palmyra to Damascus. It's in fact going here, behind the mountains. But the position of all those are at passages across these mountains here. So when you're coming from the south, you have to go here, up, then there's a fort. So they simply controlled the movements of the Bedouins from the winter pastures to the summer pastures by controlling the important passages in the mountains as we see here. But they have to invest in that. They didn't need to do that in the Palmyrene period because they have the social, political, family connections to the Baja. Now they needed military force to do that. That changed when we, from about 500 to 600, because then there was tribes from the Baja who took over, as an example, Palmyra, Banu Kalb. They controlled Palmyra, used it as a tribal center. And by that, they remained the close connection between the city and the Baja continued with those tribes. And also, when we go to the Umayyad Caliphate, they built these beautiful desert castles, and the dynasty was connected with the most important tribes on the Baja in marriage. Simply, that was also a way of controlling it. But when we reached the Umayyad period, the Ottoman period, things really changed. And that's the situation in the Ottoman period. Let's go back. Tadmur here was reduced to a large village. There were small villages here and here, but otherwise all the territory here was, controlled by big tribes like the Mawali, Anasa, and etc. And really, the governor in Aleppo had no control what was going on the dry steppe. And we can see that in Palmyra, the population was reduced to a fraction of what it was in antiquity, and the people moved inside the walls of the temple of Bel, and they built a small castle on the top of the mountain just in Palmyra, hoping to control things, but in fact they didn't.
Okay, so that shows very well how the social connections between the Palmyrenes and Palmyra benefited both sides equally well, and also how much the cost was raised for the occupation of that area when the social system of Palmyra fell down after Zenobia.
I mean, in the modern history of Syria, in the civil wars, we can also see how the tribes has an important role in the conflict going across the borders between Iraq and Syria, etc. And the central government simply had no control of those tribes. So, not much have changed.
Not much, it seems. So, thank you very much, Christian, for this fascinating interview. I think we now have a very good view not only of the Palmyrene, but also how geographical and climatical factors shape history. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to share my fascination and knowledge of the Palmyra.